Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. In this episode here on April 1st, 2023, I thought it's an opportunity to talk about the fool within. And what I mean by this idea of the fool within is hopefully an opportunity to explore foolishness, playfulness, the manner in which expression cannot make sense, or the way in which expression cannot make sense. And so I wonder if there's a way to explore our relationships with others where we shift our thinking about how we are with people, how we act in certain, at work or in a relationship. We shift that and we think, well, what would it be like to do the opposite? What would it be like to be the fool? And here I'm using the word fool not in a negative way or in a derogatory way. I'm using it to explore this idea of the kind of court gesture, the part of our psyche, the part of our culture that can say that which cannot be spoken. And so how do we get ourselves into a situation where we can start to speak about the things that cannot be said? And one of the themes in the last podcast was this idea that we drive towards and pull towards and are drawn towards inauthenticity. And that may seem counterintuitive, but as I explored in that podcast, really what's happening is it's an habitual way of being. And authenticity is shattering this habitual way, hence being authentic, because we are not the conditions that we are in. We are something beyond those conditions. And that's a part of transformation, part of change. And being a fool is a part of that process. Being a fool is a part of the process of transforming ourselves to go beyond how we see ourselves, how we understand ourselves. So one example might be is you've lost your job or you've been terminated from something and you haven't been seen. You've been ignored and negated, and you are feeling the pain and the weight of that experience. Well, what might the fool do? Well, the fool might say, well, what does it matter anyway? What else can I do? The fool might say, let's explore something else. Let's make fun of them. Let's challenge them. Let's mock them in some way. And from that, start to create a new way of understanding our own circumstance that transcends that feeling of being condemned, being terminated and thrown away and disregarded and unheard. Now, admittedly, this might be easier said than done. So we're asking ourselves to, just for a moment, be the fool, explore the foolishness, and say, where else can I go with my experience? So when I think about things that I'm going through in my life right now, things that are frustrating or inescapable in whatever way, then playing with this notion of the fool is a way to play with what else can I do? And to be honest, I really have no idea. So the first step is to have no idea. To be a fool is to be okay with or to develop a relationship with having no idea. And that begs the question, well, how do we feel about uncertainty? Well, typically speaking, we want to avoid uncertainty. Uncertainty can be unsettling. And so we want to have a plan. We want to have a methodology. We want to have a routine. We want to have whatever it is that helps us to contain our experience in a way that is sufficient for us to exist, but not so overwhelming that we don't really know what the parameters of existence will be or are. So if we start to challenge that notion of what we are, we start to think, well, maybe I'm a different kind of person than I thought. Maybe I have a different kind of career than I thought. Maybe I'm a different gender. Maybe I'm a different age. Maybe I'm different. And again, it's really about challenging ourselves to be the fool. And in doing that, we might find that there's a dimension of our personality that has been excluded. So can we explore this uncertainty as step one to try and get into exploring other aspects of our own experience? So step one, uncertainty. Step two is we make a gesture. We take a step. We do something that starts that ball rolling. We'll notice, of course, like with step one, that there was this sense that the process is unfolding in a way that seems uncertain, and our relationship to uncertainty is unsettling. So we've already acknowledged that. So we now we can expect that to be a part of this experience. We can expect uncertainty, as paradoxical as that clearly is to say. So step one is the relationship with uncertainty. And step 2 is taking the step, seeing where it leads us. Now we get into step 3. This is where insight arises. In this process of insight, what's happening is there's something that arises that is a surprise, that is authentic. And so we've moved from accepting uncertainty to moving into taking a step or making a gesture, doing some kind of action, and then being open to, because we were already open to uncertainty and we've already taken a chance or taken a step, a leap of faith, if you will, to some form of insight. And this is where we keep on going until we find a spark. We don't stop until we find something. Now, when you find something, when something kind of occurs to you, you might notice that before you get to that, you might notice that you have these doubts. Well, it's not the right insight. It's not a good insight. I'm not getting the insight fast enough. So, and it's all of these different, as I say, doubts. But if you can roll it back and say, okay, I've gone from uncertainty, I've gone to taking a gesture, and now I'm in this experience where I am, in whatever way, exploring insights. And I'm noticing this judgment. I've already done the uncertainty thing, so let's go back and I'm just going to use my uncertainty. I'm going to take another gesture. In other words, keep going. Uncertainty, take a step, make a gesture, and then wait for insight, see what happens. If we repeat this process over and over again, we start to get into a flow. And one of the things we might notice is that the idea that we should know in advance is really what we're experiencing as being the newness of this experience. Less so than the necessary, whether the insight's good or whether we even get an insight. It's the experience that we're experiencing, which sounds kind of funny, the experience that we're experiencing of what it's like to not know. This is moving into a kind of flow state, a kind of authentic state, which is shifting us out of the certainty, the parameters within which we operate when we make our assumptions about who we are, who other people are, what's right, what's wrong, what's this, what's that. We start to challenge the very notion of these constructs as in any way being certain. Now, of course, when we grow up in a culture and we grow up in a society, we are used to things being done in a certain way, but it doesn't take much for us to look and see how that operates differently in other cultures. So, for example, we take a trip somewhere and we have an experience where all of a sudden things look familiar, yet they're all different. It's almost like a dream. It's as if everything shifted on an axis a little bit. Or we can watch a history doc and we can see, okay, this is what people were doing 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And notice, of course, there's similarities, yet clearly there are differences. Here, too, what we're doing is we explore this kind of April Fool's Day experience. We start to get into this relationship to something that goes beyond what we already know. So, if we go back to step 1, and I'm going to slow things down here finally. If we go back to step 1, and we say, here I am. It's April 1st. What do I think? Here I am. It's April 1st. What do I think? If we just take a moment and we say, here I am. It's April 1st. What do I feel? Here I am. It's April 1st. What do I think and what do I feel? And we embrace the foolishness, the fool within. So what do we feel? What do we think? I'm wondering what's next. I'm thinking I need to have an idea. It's a podcast. It's supposed to be about 30 minutes. I'm only not at 10 minutes yet. So I'm thinking, well, how am I going to fill the next 20 minutes? And then I wonder, does it need to be 20 minutes? Sorry, does it need to be 30 minutes? Does it need to be 20 minutes for that matter? Does it need to actually be anything? Well, a part of me thinks, yeah, it does need to be whatever the length is, in this case 30 minutes, because I've done a bunch of them. And they've all been around that long. Some longer, but generally speaking. So does that habit, does that make it true? Well, if you go back and look, they're actually not all 30 minutes, even though the average is. You can start to say, well, okay, if the average is 30, but maybe not the episodes are not always 30 minutes, well, then I guess that means they don't have to be 30 minutes. So what happens here is we start to shift out of these habitual ways of thinking and start to explore something that goes beyond what our immediate experience is. I think this is an interesting way to break down the way in which we structure our thought habitually. And my experiences recently have been in a situation where I feel very much like I'm confronted by those habitual voices. And in a way, a part of my strategy with this podcast was to start in a different tone, because anyone who's going to keep listening to this podcast will follow it past a point that others won't follow it past. In other words, the people who might listen to this, the people who might explore this, are just letting it roll, letting it play, letting it unfold. The people who are looking for something specific, they've already turned it off, because it wasn't giving them anything specific they could hold on to. Really, what's happening in this process is you and I are talking right now. Inside your head, you're hearing my voice and you're engaging with it. And there's a conversation that is going on. Similarly, I'm having a conversation with you. And this is not literally you and is not literally me, but it is a dialectical expression. And I call it an expression because it has no empirical or objective certainty. It is unknown. The conversation is unknown. And if we step into the unknown conversation and we start to move away from the sense of certainty that ground us in certain beliefs that then perpetuate certain responses that are inauthentic, and again, building off of last podcast, the notion of inauthenticity and authenticity, and how we tend to strive for inauthenticity. And the experience of authenticity, the experience of breaking through the habit and the routine, involves step 1, uncertainty, step 2, making a gesture, and step 3, waiting. The step 4, if you will, is we don't really know what we're waiting for. So how can we wait without waiting? How can we speak without speaking? How can we listen without listening? And what this means is, when we listen and we have an idea of what it is, we're not listening. When we speak and we've already adopted a way of speaking that creates the context, and we are kind of speaking, you could almost think of it as speaking idiomatically. We're not actually speaking, we're repeating. And so if we're listening and speaking in an authentic way, we're exploring something that goes beyond the way in which we habitually, or however the pattern is derived, we go beyond that into something that speaks without speaking, that listens without listening. This is a somewhat abstract notion, but just as I slowed down before, just as I kind of put the brakes on, did you notice any shift in that process? Did you notice that there was any kind of movement in how you were thinking and feeling? That just the rhythm of what I was saying, not so much what I was saying or the content in terms of, the steps 1, 2, 3 and so on, but really the overall feeling of what it is to have a voice move in a way that is somewhat maybe different than you might expect when you're listening to a podcast, even when you're listening to this podcast. Typically, I have a basic rhythm, I have a basic structure, but in this one, I've tried to interrupt it in some way and constantly interrupt the idea that I'm talking about any specific thing. So it's in a way trying to be a podcast about something at the same time as a podcast that's about nothing. It's trying to listen without being heard. It's trying to speak without speaking. And as paradoxical as that clearly is, what the notion or the overall concept is can we just listen? Can we just speak without already having an idea of what we're hearing, without already having an idea of what we're saying? And that moves us into this really interesting place. And playing with this idea of being a fool, can we be a bit of a fool to explore a bit of the experience of not knowing? So let's take another example. If I have an idea of who I am, my identity, I have a career path, let's say, and I work at that career path for several years. And then through a series of events over the course of, say, 3 or 4 months, that career seems to vanish. Well, I'm experiencing that change in a disjointed way, where I had an idea of what I was doing, I had an idea of how I was listening and how I was speaking and how it all made sense. And then something happened that completely undermined my way of existing and understanding my existence. In other words, what I was experiencing was a shock of some kind. And what that left me feeling was a desire to try and get that life that I have lost back. That idea I had of myself. I'm trying to get that idea I had of myself back. But that idea of myself is now gone. I don't have it anymore. So, what do? This is when I got thinking about this idea of the fool. Of course, I can get upset, I can get angry, I can do all of these different things, but what if I just become a fool? What if I become all that I am not supposed to be? What if I animate myself in a way that seems entirely paradoxical, that doesn't acknowledge the loss as such, yet does acknowledge the change and see it as it's my chance to become the Joker. It's my chance to become the fool. It's my chance to become the absurdist, the surrealist. It's my chance to break with the patterns that I had been thinking would be my life, that stopped being my life. And now, as a result, I have to face something that is unknown. And I can do that with regret and sorrow and sadness and all the rest of it, which I will do. But I can also do it by exploring the fool within. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this is any kind of solution, because it is not a solution. It is only another thing we do when our life has been, in whatever way, profoundly interrupted by the shocks that we experience in life. And this goes to something I was touching upon at the end of the last podcast, which is, in coming out of COVID, what I am sensing increasingly through this experience is we did not come through it as a global body thinking we need to come together, that we have underwent this extraordinary experience, all of us around the globe, and we need to find ways to address the vulnerabilities that became really apparent during the pandemic. Now, these were apparent before, but they became amplified. And what I'm seeing is the opposite. What I'm seeing, and maybe it's just me, what I'm seeing is, after this really once-in-a-lifetime kind of experience, the sense is we can actually have millions upon millions upon millions of people die, and everybody moves forward. And we can have millions upon millions upon millions of people be exploited, and we're just going to keep on exploiting them. And so this has me thinking here on the Day of Fools, so to speak, if the situation is brutally absurd, and holding to the patterns which try and look to hold on to a system that is brutally absurd are one option, Might another option be to challenge and confront the way in which we exist in a world by maybe being a little foolish, by maybe exploring options that go beyond the confines of our own understanding as it stands and as they stand now? If this is the case, that we can go back to the game of finding uncertainty, taking the step, and seeking insight, are we not finding a kind of authenticity to the experience that really was a shattering through this pandemic experience? And are we still trying to understand conceptually and otherwise what actually happened? And my sense is it's like a dream that we're in and out of at the exact same time. And so there is a kind of absurdity, foolishness, insanity, something that is dysregulated to this whole entire experience. And as I look at the relationships and the different things that people are trying to do to come together, I'm not seeing this movement that's bringing everybody together. I'm seeing fragmentation. So is that a kind of uncertainty? Is there, in a sense, an uncertainty that is just organically or naturally occurring? And the question is, can we embrace this uncertainty and start to explore relationships that look beyond the current ways of understanding ourselves in the world? And I don't know what the answer to this is, because I don't know what the answer in my own life is. How do I respond to this kind of change? I had a clear idea of how things were going to be, and that broke. That fell apart. So how do I, on a micro level, manage? Then consider what it would be on a macro level, on a global level, on a global scale. And in my mind, I'm left with this paradox, which is I want to know at the same time I want to not know. I want to know in the sense that I want to be safe, but I want to not know in the sense that I want inspiration. And can you have one without the other? And I think that idea of being a fool plays into something that's very, very interesting. Can we actually take ourselves to a new state of being that is not sure or grounded or in whatever way known, and yet exist in that kind of unknown state, that kind of floating state, until we get to a point where we find something? And my question is it okay for us to see and feel ourselves in a way that goes beyond our current understanding, yet does not try to seek an answer, and in so doing create just another form of rhetoric? Because are we seeing new answers, or are we seeing old answers shown in new ways? And I wonder if, because we're not coming out of this global pandemic with a global sensation of we are all united, I'm wondering if we're still using old answers to try and address new issues, or the potential to address, I shouldn't say new issues, but to address things in a new or distinct way. So what does this all really have to do with April Fools? Nothing. But it does have something to do with this idea of shifting how we think about ourselves and moving away from certain patterns of belief. And I'm wondering if, as in my personal experience of having this thing that I worked on for a long period of time fall apart, and thinking, well, what am I going to do? It did fall apart. And so this is a micro example that I'm drawing, sort of insights from, and then I'm applying to this macro example. I'm not confusing the two, but I am saying that, well, how might I learn from this micro example and then apply this to this macro example? And what I can learn is, I actually don't know what the future is. I can't pretend to know what the future is. And so maybe there's a way to draw from this experience of fragmentation and find a new unity. And what I am waiting for is what that structure or form will be. And drawing upon the April Fool's analogy, I need to be a fool to do that. I need to be vulnerable. I need to be unsure. I need to take chances. I need to have a relationship with the unknown or unknowing. I need to have a relationship with uncertainty. And if I can do that, maybe, just maybe, something will arise that lights a new path. And yes, in time, it'll become redundant and a routine and all the rest of it. Yet, I will have made some step, because if I sense one thing, if I stay in my frustration or my bitterness or my current state of mind, I will be dwindling. I will not be growing. And if I can find some way to look at this, find some way to step out of my current perspective, and if being a fool can be one way to try and do that, then isn't it worth it to try to be a fool? So, if we go back to the beginning of this podcast and we think about the idea of these steps, we think about the idea of getting into uncertainty and seeing where that takes us and feeling that in a genuine way. By genuine, I mean exploring the fact that we are feeling the sense of uncertainty. We then say, I'm going to just take a step. I'm going to do action. I'm going to try something. And from there we think, okay, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for insight. And I don't even know what that insight is. I'm just going to try. I'm going to give it a shot and see what happens. And then we stop. And then everything freezes. And we wait, and we think. And then we try it again. We think, okay, let's kind of take a step into uncertainty, see what that is, and go back and go back and go back. And we keep on doing it until we start to feel ourselves shift. And just as here in this podcast, I've explored this shift in terms of how I'm approaching the structure of it, so too can we explore how we think about what we're doing and where we are in our lives, including how we deal with loss, including how we deal with disappointment, including how we deal with doubt. Can we reframe our existence? Not in a wise way, in the sense that we might typically think of being wise, but in a foolish way, where we take a chance. And we trust this inner intuitive fool to not guide us in a negative way or in a negative direction, but that this part of us may actually have some insights that we won't get otherwise. And so if we can trust aspects of ourselves and explore aspects of ourselves that are really outside of how we see ourselves, might we start to expand our own experience. And in expanding our own experience and expanding our own language, new reasons arise. If you think of it this way, if the horizon is open, we can see more across the horizon. If we look to a vista and it seems wide to us, we can take our time and see the vastness, and from there experience a kind of connectivity that goes beyond the feeling of isolation and, dare I say, transcends the sense of alienation, because we are more connected. And in so feeling this, in so being this, in so even having this, we find within ourselves that the fool within is this healing voice that we can discover simply by stepping into uncertainty, making a gesture, and then waiting for insight.